Okay, this is board meeting for the Montecito Fire Protection District. It is July 22nd at 2 p.m. The special board meeting will be held in person and via teleconference connection in accordance with the requirements set out in Government Code Section 54953E and pursuant to the findings and authority set out in the Montecito Fire Protection District Resolution 2022-11. Members of the public will be able to observe the regular meeting and provide public comments via Zoom with the Zoom link or by calling the listed number. Any member of the public who would like to provide public input on a listed item on the agenda might utilize the raise hand feature through the Zoom app or enter 9 if participating by telephone only. The host will be notified and you will be recognized to speak on the agenda item in the order of such requests are received by the district. Okay, agenda items may be taken out of order as shown. First item is public comment. Do we have any public comment?
You want to say it's for non-agenda items?
Oh. Is see none, or is that none? Okay. Closing public comment. Item number 2 is receive the presentation from Chelsea. Is it Riker? Is that right? Tell me if I say your name wrong. Fair and FERS regarding the emergency evacuation study, and this is strategic plan goal number 1. And Chief Taylor will take the beginning.
Thanks very much, Director Lee. It's our pleasure to welcome Chelsea from Fair and FERS to give your presentation. But before we turn it over to her, I wanted to recognize several staff members that spend 10 months working very hard with the consultants. They include Christina Pavuzzi, Mae Borges, Alex Bromont, Travis Ederer, Aaron Briner, David Niels, and they were all led by Neil Elmquist, who was our lead on this project. And they have collectively a few hundred hours in, and we're very pleased to present the final report. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chelsea to introduce herself and her team and to make that presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Chelsea Richer. I'm a senior associate at Fair and Peers. Fair and Peers is a traffic engineering and transportation consulting firm. We have offices all across California actively working on evacuation related projects right now, as well as many other types of traffic engineering and transportation planning projects. And I'm really excited and honored to be here today to present to you all. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think I have the capability of doing that on my end. Can someone confirm that they can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you. As Chief Taylor mentioned, we've been working on this study for about 10 months now. We're really pleased to present the final version of the study, some key findings and the recommendations that are in the packet that you've all hopefully received and had a chance to review. So today's agenda will be to go over some of the results that are highlighted in that report, including the results of the community survey that was conducted at the outset of this project last year, review of the after action report literature that's available from the last several years of fires and emergency evacuations across the state, and some key interviews that were conducted in support of this project. We'll also be reviewing the analysis process and the modeling results. This is some of the quantitative basis for, or the technical analytical basis, I should say, using a tool that was created for this project, specifically for the community of Montecito, to understand how congestion and traffic would build up around the roadway network with a certain set of input parameters. So I'll go through some of that as well. And then I'll also give a very brief highlight of the recommendations. I have more extensive recommendations, but in the interest of time, we'll see where we get. And if anyone's interested in diving deeper into the recommendations, I'm certainly happy to do that as well. So starting with the survey, after action report, literature review, and interview findings. This part of the project is really intended to be some context setting, understanding the community's understanding of evacuation and sort of perspectives on evacuation, as well as understanding how the past several events have gone through the literature review and also through the interviews, and not just in Montecito, of course, but across California. So starting with the after action report, our team reviewed 18 after action reports across California that were created in post-fire actions. They all had some similarities, some differences, and so what we've done is really just pulled forward and amplified the most common similarities across the after action reports that were reviewed. And so first, starting with communication, messaging, and information sharing, some of the reflections that are captured in after action reports noted that it was inconsistent somewhat between event to event, sometimes within the same geography, sometimes across the state. And so that was definitely one finding that can help to inform some of our recommendations around just the consistency of communication, messaging, and information sharing. The reports indicated that in some cases, destination shelters were unprepared for an influx of evacuees. And in many cases, hotels lacked capacity, again, because they were serving their normal purpose for tourism, but didn't have the capacity to accommodate all of the evacuees that were quickly flooding into those areas that were the destinations from the evacuation perspective. And there were also some similarities across the 18 reports that showed that re-entry was inefficient, and then again, inconsistent messaging could be confusing to residents who were re-entering after the evacuation was lifted and people were able to return home. So just some quick findings here help to inform some of our recommendations. We also conducted a resident survey. We received 118 responses from residents around Montecito. We received a few from outside Montecito as well, but we whittled it down and really just provided some results based on the 118 resident responses. And the top 3 evacuation concerns that we heard about were related to the ability to return home. So again, in that after action or after evacuation period of reentry. A lot of concern about transportation and road conditions and the limitations that those might have on the ability to evacuate. And then lastly, knowing where they were going, the destination during an evacuation being communicated clearly and having capacity to take them once they arrive. Overall, we found that there was a high evacuation knowledge and a high willingness to evacuate that was expressed by community members in Montecito, as well as a high confidence in sheltering in place as a potential strategy for managing through a fire. Lastly, we conducted what we're calling key agency interviews. So we had representatives from 5 agencies that were contacted and interviewed. We developed the interview list in collaboration with staff that were working on this project. And we focused those conversations to really understand, and from their perspective, boots on the ground during evacuation events, what were the key things that we should be considering when developing a report such as this. And so we heard about really 3 key areas of focus. First, in the pre-planning space, so really amplifying and emphasizing coordination, engagement, and preparation before an evacuation event is necessary. Second, focusing on public information and noticing, again, creating standards for messaging, making sure that that information is clear and well circulated and is really addressing the specific needs of the community. So in a couple of cases, we heard, for example, the need to create specific messaging around people who had cattle or people who had animals that they kept on their property. So those have much different evacuation needs than just an average person who's evacuating themselves and maybe their family as well. So creating really specific information to address those critical needs. And then lastly, creating multilingual messaging, also having translators and interpreters on site at evacuation shelters was a big important consideration, especially in communities where there's a high population of multilingual individuals. Lastly, the post-evacuation and recovery was another really common emerging theme from the interviews. And really they emphasized the need for clear communication around re-entry again. So a lot of consistency between these 3 methods of context setting and sort of information gathering before we moved into the actual analysis process, really focusing on the communication themes, the clarity of messaging, and those post-evacuation and recovery considerations for when people are ready to re-enter the community. I'm going to speak a little bit about the analysis process and the results, and I'll go slowly through this section, I think, because it can get technical, and I'll do my best to keep it as high level as possible. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers, so please feel free to make a note of anything that doesn't make sense or you'd like me to revisit and come back to, and I'm happy to go deeper into any of the analysis pieces. So we started out the analysis using what's called the Sbcag travel demand model. This is the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments Regional Travel Demand Model. And this is a pre-existing tool. It's created and maintained by the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, and it's used for regional planning purposes. But it has a lot of benefits that can be translated to evacuation projects like this. And what it does is includes all of the land use, all of the socioeconomic data, and all of the travel data that's associated with how people move around the county, included already in this model off the shelf. So what we did is we took the model off the shelf for the whole county, and we basically cut out the Montecito community from that geography, including some area around the community, of course, both east, west, north, and not south into the ocean, but all of the ways that people could move out of Montecito. We created a sort of sub-area zone that included Montecito as well as part of Santa Barbara. And then we calibrated that slice of the model to make sure that it was working correctly and really reflecting travel patterns within the city of within the community of Montecito and the adjacent city patterns in Santa Barbara. And this is because when you start at that regional level and you move to a sub-regional level or a community level, it's just important to make sure that the model is still working correctly, even at a smaller or different geographical scale. So once we went through that calibration process, and again, really with the critical input from the team at Montecito Fire to make sure that it really reflected baseline conditions that were reflective of reality, showing the travel patterns during peak hour periods when there's lots of congestion on the network, during school periods where there's maybe congestion in particular spots related to pickup and drop off. So really made sure that we had a lot of on the ground input from the team that knows the community so well. And then the third piece that we did once we had the model calibrated was we deployed Evac Plus, which is a tool that we've developed to sort of synchronize with the travel demand models that exist already on the regional level. And it includes what's called a dynamic traffic assignment tool. And the way that you can think about this is if you're using a GPS on your phone to direct you to a location, it's going to route you to sort of the fastest path available on the fly. And you might, if you're familiar with that tool, remember being, directed one way initially, and then as congestion changes while you're on the route, it may offer you a different route and you can choose to accept or reject that different route. So essentially this dynamic traffic assignment tool does a very similar thing in which it finds the fastest pathway for each trip to go to a destination that's preset as part of the assumptions within this model. So we worked with Montecito Fire to define the scenario assumptions for two scenarios that would really capture what might happen or some reasonable assumptions that might happen during possible fire conditions, wildland fires. And again, really relying heavily on the expertise of the Montecito Fire staff to help us define those scenarios and how fast people would need to evacuate potentially during certain kinds of conditions. And then we deployed that tool with the model to understand how congestion would look on the roadway network if those assumptions were put into the model. So I'm going to go through each of those two scenarios and show some maps from the results of the analysis. The first scenario parameters included a phased evacuation of evacuation zones 1, 2, and 3, as well as 8 and 9 during that peak afternoon period. And the peak afternoon period between 3 and 4:30 tends to be a very high period of congestion, not just because people within Montecito are moving around, but also because people are moving through Montecito from Carpinteria or Los Angeles to Santa Barbara and vice versa. And so there's a lot of through traffic that also uses the 101, uses potentially State Route 192, and moves through the community, as well as all of the normal travel that's happening within the community from residents and visitors and employees who work there. So we wanted to really focus in on that 3 to 4:30 period as sort of the peak time to consider, maybe a worst case scenario, you might think. And see what would happen if a phased evacuation of zones 1, 2, and 3 were required to evacuate within 15 minutes, so very fast response time. And then zones 8 and 9 were required to evacuate in a longer response time, a 90-minute period, starting at that same period at 3 p.m. And for this scenario, we sent most evacuation trips outside the Montecito model area. So we assumed that if there was enough of a risk or enough of a hazard to warrant an evacuation from these zones, that the evacuation destinations would actually be outside of the model boundary. And I'll show you a map in one moment. We did assume that some were going to probably go to Santa Barbara. So thinking about the hotels that are available there, and even sort of if you're thinking about a short-term evacuation, you might think maybe I can return home today. I'm not going to go too far. So we did assume that some share of the trips just went to that Santa Barbara neighboring community, but that most of them were sent outside that Montecito model area. And so that's what scenario 1 looks like on the map. So the first, second, and third evacuation zones are evacuating that 15-minute phase 1. And then the 2 zones south of State Route 192 are evacuating in phase 2. And so you can see the way that sort of shakes out across the community, and again across the eastern part of Santa Barbara as well. So this is essentially the extent of our model, looking to include some of the community here in Santa Barbara as well. So what our model does is then take all of the people who live and work in these zones, and it puts them onto the transportation network, the roadway network, with their vehicles, and sort of models out what might happen if all of the evacuation phase 1 zones had to evacuate in 15 minutes, and then all of the evacuation phase 2 zones had to evacuate in 90 minutes. And you can see in this graph, and I won't dwell too long on this, but you can see in this graph that during the first 30 minutes or so of the evacuation window of 4 to 6:30 really is, or 3 to 6:30 when it clears the system. This yellow line down here are the spike of evacuation trips that are actually happening on the roadway network. The red line here is all of the other trips that are happening through Montecito that are unrelated to the evacuation. And those are all of the background trips coming and going through the community, in some cases stopping in other parts of the community that are not evacuating, but in a lot of cases just moving straight through and sort of going east-west on 192 or the 101. And so you can see the yellow line makes up, some share of the red line, but there's actually quite a lot of traffic within the community of Montecito, and there's just this spike that's created as part of the evacuation in the first 30 minutes or so. And then there's a little bit of an evacuation effect all the way through the rest of that evacuation window period. And then actually in the evening peak period, you can see that it really peaks out here with sort of the top part of this evening peak period happening after the evacuation window is over. The gray line behind here is just what would happen under normal conditions, under non-evacuation scenario. So that's the baseline. We also looked at what would happen at 8 specific locations throughout the community, and it's basically the same information shared on this set of graphs, but for 8 different locations within the community. The previous graph was sort of overall within the model what's happening. And this goes deeper into specific locations. And these 8 locations correspond to these stars on this map here. So you can see we picked some locations near the 101. We picked a couple of locations sort of in the central part of Montecito, and then a couple of locations here up in the hillside area. And we're evacuating, again, just as a reminder, this area towards the west of the community first, followed by this area south of the 192, but also on the western side of the community within a longer time frame. So that was why we picked these locations to really focus in on. So the next set of maps are going to be going through the model results, essentially. And again, this is really meant to be a tool to show what could happen on the network in terms of congestion if those assumptions about 15-minute required evacuation from zones 1, 2, and 3 and 90-minute evacuation from zones 8 and 9 hit the network all during those prescribed time periods. And so this is what happens at the beginning of the evacuation period. So this is where phase 1 is really at its peak. So all of these northern communities here in zones 1, 2, and 3 are hitting that network all at once. And then some of them are already starting to travel through the network to go to the 101 through Olive Mill and San Isidro and Sycamore Canyon and Cabrillo. So some of these ramps here are having some effects within the first 15 minutes, 30 minutes or so. And then these communities down here are also starting a slower evacuation. So we're in the early evacuation period of that second phase. This map shows after that first evacuation period is done. So all of the phase 1 zones have now cleared through the network, and the phase 2 zones are still clearing through the network, but more slowly. And so you can see that there's still some congestion building up on present on these really important north-south connections to the freeway, as well as a little bit of congestion still throughout the rest of the network as those evacuation trips happen. This shows after, again, that first phase is over and late in the 90-minute period for that second evacuation phase, most of the network that is in the evacuation zones themselves by this point have cleared. There is, still traffic on the network, but it's not standstill congestion. But these roads that are still connection points to that freeway access ramps are still definitely experiencing some congestion. And lastly, this is a map of, after the evacuation period has passed, after the 90-minute window is done, what does the network look like? And so now we're starting to see just the normal amount of congestion that might be present in Montecito on the network again. So again, some congestion on San Isidro and Hot Springs and Olive Mill, again, leading up to the ramps. And now we're in a peak period after work phase. So there's congestion now just related to people moving through Montecito, going to and from their residences from their home in both directions, east and west, from Santa Barbara to LA and vice versa. So those are the results of the first scenario. The second scenario is very similar to the first in terms of a lot of the assumptions that were made about timing and how the evacuation zones are phased. The difference is that we're now focused on the east side of the community rather than the west side of the community. So on the east side of the community, we have zones 4, 5, and 6 evacuating between that first 15-minute period where they have to respond very quickly to a fire evacuation. And then zones 10 and 11 south of State Route 192 evacuating over that longer 90-minute window because they're a little bit further away from the fire spread. Again, we sent most of these evacuation trips outside of the model area. So a lot of those parameters are exactly the same between scenario 1 and 2. Really, the difference is the geography that we're looking at. And so that's what this looks like on a map. Evacuation phase 1 is comprised of zones 4, 5, and 6 north of State Route 192. And evacuation phase 2, that slower evacuation phase, is zone 10 and 11. Here is again a very similar plot from what we showed in scenario 1. We have the evacuation trips peaking here in that first window. Oh, excuse me, go back. The evacuation trips peaking in the first period of the evacuation window, and then a slower but persistent trickle of evacuation trips through the remaining part of the window. That contributes overall to create this peak in the model area, and followed by the slower but increasing amount of traffic in the model area, largely because of those non-evacuation trips really picking up as we hit 4 to 5 p.m. Commute period for the surrounding communities. And again, this gray line behind is the baseline condition without any evacuation scenario. This shows, again, 8 locations that we zoomed in on to understand what's happening at particular segments or particular parts of the network, again, chosen to reflect where the evacuation trips were coming from and where they were likely to hit the network. So again, because we're evacuating the eastern parts of the community here, we picked locations here on the east side. We also picked some ramp locations, and we also picked some of the places that we saw had some congestion during that first phase, where we thought were likely to be congested during the second scenario as well. The next set of maps are going to be essentially the same exact flow of time. So we're going to have one that's at the very beginning of the evacuation period, one that's at sort of the midpoint, but after that first crunched 15 minutes of evacuation is over, one that's approaching the end of the evacuation period, and then one after the evacuation concludes, after the evacuation window concludes, I should say. So I'll pan through those now. So here's the first time slice we're looking at. Again, this is the first window of the first phase of evacuation is happening, quickly, and everyone in those first zones are being evacuated quickly onto the network. And then you can see that they're, again, starting to trickle through pretty quickly into the roads that connect people to the freeway. So those north-south connection points where there are ramps onto the freeway in particular. And it's the early part of the second phase. So we do have some people evacuating from these two zones south of State Route 192, but really the majority of the evacuation trips are coming from these zones in the north. This is the second time slice. So all of these zones, the trips coming from these zones have now cleared the network. So they are no longer moving from their home or their residence or employment place to the network, but they're either on the network somewhere else or they are completely cleared through their evacuation trip at this point. So that first phase is complete. They're moving through the network potentially here. You can see that there's a lot of sort of spread of the congestion outside this area to, again, those north-south connection points to the 101, as well as some of the high roads here as people try and make connections out of the model area or out of the community, finding different paths. So you can see there's some congestion here where people are taking this mountain road towards, other alternative exit points to get into Santa Barbara rather than going down the main north-south connectors. And again, just to repeat something I said earlier, this is functioning a lot like your GPS if you're looking for directions on your phone, in that it is trying to find the quickest path out. And so if this is overly congested here at these ramps, on ramps to the freeway. So now we're in the post-evacuation period for phase one. Everything in these northern zones have cleared, and we're late in the evacuation period for phase two. So there's still some trips clearing out of these zones down here, but mostly cleared through the network. There's some lingering congestion on some of those roads where it really had built up a lot in the previous map. And then now this is sort of at the conclusion after the evacuation window has passed. We do see some congestion again building up in other places throughout the community that weren't subject to the evacuation and are likely to just have other trips happening unrelated to the evacuation. So Westmont College is over here, so there's potentially commute trips for people who work there coming in and out at that point later in the afternoon. Okay, so that was a lot of maps and a lot of technical explanation of the modeling we did. I think I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the recommendations, and then we'll open it up to some questions, and feel free to ask about anything I've presented on. I'm happy to go deeper if anyone would like. Okay, so we had a really comprehensive set of recommendations developed and are shown in that report. In the interest of not rehashing all of the bullet points here, I'm sure if you've taken a pass through, you've seen sort of the variety of recommendations that have been made in there. I will say that we've categorized the recommendations into these 5 big buckets. So the first one is wildfire mitigation, and this includes recommendations around how to manage the fuel loads within the Montecito community, particularly around evacuation routes or segments of the roadway network that built up to congestion fastest, how to manage the brush clearance on the side, and sort of how to prioritize some of those wildfire mitigation methods to actually prevent the fire from becoming bad enough to need to evacuate all of the zones that quickly in the way that we've demonstrated through the model tool, giving more time for people to actually make their evacuation trip and less congestion building up on the network as a result of having just more time to do the evacuation. We've also included a set of demand side recommendations. And when we say demand side, what we mean is how people are evacuating. So how many trips they're taking, whether they're evacuating with one car for their entire household, or they're evacuating every car that they own at the same time. So maybe one driver per vehicle, and multiple cars leaving one single household means multiple vehicles on the roadway network and more congestion. So thinking about ways to manage that. And then thinking about regional coordination to improve communications and information sharing, and really understanding how the folks who are responsible for executing an evacuation can help people do it in a more efficient and easiest way possible. And then the third big bucket of recommendations we've made are what we're calling supply side recommendations. And so this is basically what the infrastructure, what the roadway network looks like and can do in order to facilitate easier evacuations. So we've identified some corridors that could be converted potentially into one-way outbound. So if you're thinking about some of those north-south corridors that had a lot of congestion, possibly converting one of those locations or one of those facilities to flush everyone out through in that southbound direction to get to the freeway, if that's necessary, and what kind of coordination would be necessary in order to make that happen. And importantly, also what roadways are wide enough in order for that to work well, so that you have maybe one lane in each direction normally, but then you convert it to 2 lanes in the same direction. You need to have a certain amount of roadway width in order to make that possible and safe. Things like signage, how you're communicating visually through variable message signs or through permanently installed signage that would indicate, high wildfire days or potentially high risk days for evacuation. Flexible operations to extend capacity. Those are things like the conversion into 2 lanes in one direction that I mentioned. Also things like roundabouts. I know there's a couple of roundabouts that are under construction right now as part of the on-ramp Caltrans 101 type construction happening on the freeway. And some of the benefits related to roundabouts as opposed to signalized intersections is that they actually process more vehicles per hour and they don't require power. So if power were to go down during an evacuation, the roundabout would still be able to process just as many vehicles onto and off of the freeway or through that intersection as it would if power's up in normal conditions. So that's one sort of resilience benefit that type of intersection control has over a traditionally signalized intersection. We know there aren't many signalized intersections in the evacuation zones we looked at, but just something else to consider. The second to last bullet point here is recommendations around external education and outreach. So building community essentially that's aware of evacuation needs and risks and what might happen during an evacuation, including potentially evacuation drills and year-round communications for how to prepare and how to be ready to evacuate. We know that the community already has quite a high awareness and understanding of evacuation needs. So this is really just sort of on top of what's already happening. We know Montecito Fire is already doing so much to do education and outreach to the community during the year. So this is really just, additional extensions of what's really already happening in order to maximize that connection that Montecito Fire has to the community. And lastly, capacity building and coordination. One of the things that really emerged through this study, and frankly through many of the studies we're doing across the state, is that there's a lot of entities involved in managing the public right-of-way, managing the roadway network. You have Caltrans with the 101, you have the County Department of Public Works for many of the roads in the community, you have the city of Santa Barbara to your neighbor to the west, who also has control over the roadway right-of-way that maybe your community will be using to evacuate outside the community. And there's many other entities. There's the County Emergency Operations and Management Office, and then also all of the emergency responders like Montecito Fire, of course, as well. And there's potential for some, fragmented information sharing or coordination. And we know, again, that Montecito already does so much in capacity building and coordination with all of those entities. And so we really just wanted to use this report as a vehicle to emphasize the importance of continuing coordination, continuing to build capacity and awareness around evacuations, and continuing to share information and results from evaluations and assessments like this with folks at Caltrans who may be thinking about, 101 construction, or folks at the county who may be thinking about, where housing should go in the county and things like that. Just all of these sort of cross-disciplinary interactions that are really important to consider. So we have a whole section in there on those kinds of recommendations as well. Another just consideration to note is that this evaluation really is focused on vehicle trips. We know that in Montecito and elsewhere, there are people who don't have access to a vehicle, whether those are students at Westmont College who don't bring their car to campus, or others throughout that have sort of access and functional needs. We know that there are people who don't drive, who don't have access to a vehicle. And so it's important to consider strategies for how to also support those community members in an evacuation when they can't self-evacuate. So this report didn't really go into that in much detail, but just wanted to raise that as a sort of final point to consider some of these additional ideas as ways to build out the resources that are available to folks who can't self-evacuate in their own vehicle. And that's it for me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that you can see me more directly. And if we need to reshare and go back to any slides, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Thanks, that was a great presentation. So we'll discuss first, right?
Yeah.
So, does anybody?
Yeah, I had a few simple questions or thoughts, especially for under recommendations. And when you're discussing a really good idea of turning two-way streets into one-way streets, how sensitive is it to also include the bike lanes temporarily, but almost make a third lane? Is that a sensitive subject of the bike coalition, or is that something you consider? That was one question. The other one is something you had said under additional consideration, Jolie, but all of these are what you mentioned about these roundabouts that are being constructed in 32 to 40 years. That have not at all been contact for a while. The thing is how they're your major exit areas. And so I was wondering if you're considering more east-west usage along APS and the other mountain roads to get to Santa Barbara. And third is just because I'm Adobe, I didn't know in your Google Maps what W/O, that usually means without, but then it didn't make sense to me in the Google Maps. Those are the three things. Okay.
Chelsea, could you hear all that?
I didn't catch most of it. I'm sorry. I caught that there was a bike lane question and then an east-west connection to Santa Barbara, and I didn't hear the third question.
I'll start
So if you
with
could
the
repeat
third
it, that would be great.
I will project my voice because I can't do it if I sit up properly. I just wanted to know in the little maps that had the sectionals, what W/O, because usually that means without. And then if I said that, it wouldn't make sense to me.
Sorry, that is west of. So W/O is west of, E/O is east of, N/O is north of, S/O is south of. My apologies.
I'm going to read them all again with that in mind. Thank you. Number one was how sensitive is the bicycle issue? Because if you could use the bike lanes temporarily without another lane, and I know the Bicycle Coalition is a little sensitive about their bike lane, but in an emergency, is that something that you were able to touch? The Holy Grail. And then the other thing was, you brought this up actually in additional considerations, and that is the roundabout construction is going to be extensive and blocking much of the egress. And so have you figured out northwest access, which is available? You mentioned it on 192 and APS and get out to Foothill, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let me start with the bike lanes and then move to the roundabouts. I think from a bike lane perspective, it's actually interesting you mentioned that, because we are thinking about ways to design facilities exactly for that purpose that can really support active transportation like bicycle use during normal conditions, but be engineered in such a way that they're wide enough and strong enough from their roadway construction perspective to support vehicles during an evacuation consideration or an evacuation scenario, or be used for that contraflow inbound access that's necessary for the folks who are actually coming in to fight the fire, which is, again, a different set of engineering requirements for fire vehicles that are much heavier than passenger vehicles. So it's not something that we looked into specifically for Montecito's community, but it is a strategy that we are thinking about and exploring as part of our sort of company-wide evacuation work that we've been doing, especially in rural areas where rural, or I would say residential areas where there is opportunity to build new active transportation facilities that can be designed in such a way for this dual purpose. So it's, yeah, not directly addressed in this report, but definitely something that we're thinking about, and it's a great idea long-term, I think, for the state. The second one you mentioned is about roundabout construction and how disruptive I think that might be in the next, 5-year period, and what are the alternatives during that period for accessing the exit points. I think that was the nature of your comment. So yeah, I think we did coordinate during the course of this study with the US 101 roads project team and tried to understand and sort of inform the scenarios that we were building out with what might happen in terms of limiting capacity during those construction periods. We didn't end up folding that into the actual analysis because it was more important, I think, to look at sort of a baseline condition or what might happen, but we would definitely be happy to run additional scenarios if that would be necessary or beneficial to understand if any of those congestion patterns change, or if there's any sort of different outcomes that we might see during periods where the construction is happening and, one of the 3 ramps is fully closed, or every ramp has sort of like a decreased capacity across the board. And those are all different input parameters that we can use the tool to adjust for. And we'd be happy to talk about that too.
Thank you.
Get your questions, all of them? Okay. Sure.
Regarding your slides here with the 101 and the red zones and the yellow, is that in real time now with that southern construction leading up to Montecito, or is that if there were no construction at all? And I know we're going to be going into a Montecito phase, but this is highly affecting what the flow looks like now, just the southern part. So is this kind of like without construction, as if there were not construction going on?
Yes, that's a great question. So the assumptions we made about the roadway capacity on the 101 did not assume any of the lanes were closed or any of the roundabouts or entrance ramps were closed. So it is in, I guess you could say, a non-construction period. With that said, we did calibrate the model during that very early phase of work to real-time congestion that was observed on the network. And so if to the extent that the real-time congestion reflects the impact of some of that construction, the model was calibrated to adjust for sort of real-time construction and do its best to reflect the flow of traffic in and out and around Montecito as it is happening now, and has happened historically. There's sort of a historic congestion index that's available. So we did look at that, but the assumptions about what, how many lanes, what's the capacity of those lanes, those are all based on sort of non-construction periods.
Okay, so all the red zones, all that is just normal traffic.
Yep.
At that peak hour without construction out of the area or in the area. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for an extensive presentation. My goodness. I think I'm going to add another word to my security word list. It's called congestion. And I'm assuming that I'm making an assumption here that your reports and reviews are all based on facts that have already happened, that have been presented historically. That, in other words, you're not in the business at this stage of projecting to the future what congestion will look like. Is that correct?
Yes, this is not intended to be like a simulation tool to show what would happen, if it's not intended to predict anything about the future. It's intended to show what would happen on the network if a certain set of input parameters were met, including which zones are evacuating, what the roadway network looks like, how many people live in Montecito, how much traffic is coming through Montecito, and then purely just looking at what it looks like on the network. There's obviously many things that affect the execution of an evacuation event. We assumed certain things about how fast people would be able to exit and actually do their evacuation based on that 15-minute and 90-minute window. That's a big assumption. So whether or not people would actually be able to evacuate that quickly, be able to ready their home and leave their home that quickly, is sort of going to be different every time, I would bet. And so, yeah, it's not intended to sort of predict anything. It's intended to daylight areas where more focus or more attention would be necessary on the network from either wildfire management, or if there's any infrastructure improvements that could help identify those locations as well. But it's not, it's not meant to be predictive in that way that I think you're asking about.
Right, and I noticed on page 41 of mine here that, to quote, that we, the fire district, should work with Santa Barbara County Planning and Development to understand developmental capacity associated with SB 9. And what this does is suggest that the word congestion will go all caps early on and some point in the future. And it makes me a little bit nervous, let's put it that way, that we're facing an imponderable here that can only increase some of the problems that you've outlined in a very thorough report. Would you agree with that? And do you see us as a governmental agency having to look further into this to evaluate the impact of future ramifications of SB 9?
Just high density, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one that's on the mind of a lot of communities as the housing crisis worsens and also the fire situation worsens across the state. And I think a lot of agencies are being very careful with where they recommend increasing density relative to wildfire hazards and other climate hazards, non-climate hazards, and what the existing infrastructure is available, like what capacity is available statewide on an existing basis. I'm not a land use planner, so on the sort of what should we do on the land use side, that's a little bit out of my expertise. But I will say that it's definitely something that the state, I think, is full steam ahead aware of and thinking about critically in terms of what kinds of requirements are going to be necessary for approval of EIRs for development projects moving forward. We've seen several already in high wildfire zones that have been rejected on the basis of not doing a sufficient evacuation analysis across the state. And we've also seen housing elements and circulation elements and safety elements also start to take into consideration the sort of network effects of general plan amendments and general plans that are being updated and housing elements that are being updated to densify, or not even densify, but just to allow more housing and more people to move into an area. So it's definitely top of mind for a lot of agencies. And I think it's already moving in that direction of requiring additional evaluation and assessment as part of some of those other environmental processes.
Well, I'll go back to the very first sentence in your recommendations, which had me set up in my chair at home. Quote, given topographic and roadway network constraints, Montecito has limited options to manage evacuation demand during an emergency scenario based on previous history and not anticipating changes that could be dramatic. So something we're going to have to deal with here at the district. So I thank you very much for a very thorough presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay. I have a couple questions for you. Some of them are just kind of facts, but when you did your baseline study, was that on a school day?
We did look at weekday 3 to 4:30 p.m. existing historical levels of congestion to calibrate the model. So we looked, I should back up and say that the model tool already is calibrated to the different fluctuating patterns during a weekday. So, peaking at 7:30 or 8 a.m. as people are going to work. Again, a little smaller peak in the afternoon as school trips pick up, and then sort of persistent peaking through that evening and afternoon, late afternoon commute period. So that's already built into the model, is that sort of time of day differences on a weekday. And then when we downscaled to Montecito and recalibrated it to make sure it was reflecting the congestion patterns on Montecito local roads as opposed to like county-wide roads, we did look at that same weekday afternoon period of historical congestion patterns. And then we also had some input from the folks at the fire department, staff at the fire department, to really fine tune some of those assumptions about particularly near schools where there's heavy pickup activity, that may bring an entire road to a standstill for 15 or 20 minutes as everyone is trying to pick up their kids. So we had some really helpful, very granular input to that process as well.
Okay, because there was kind of two parts to that. One is school year or school time, scenario. And then in the summer, the freeway ends up, or in my opinion, we see a lot more congestion on the freeway during the tourist season, during the summer, where it slacks off during the winter. One of my other questions were on the traffic control at key intersections. So it was my understanding that the sheriff controls the evacuation, correct?
That's correct.
So in these choke points, like where you have stop signs or whatever, when they were doing down at the freeway, they had traffic monitors that were helping people come in the morning to monitor the off-ramp or on-ramp, off-ramp, so that people could get off the freeway quicker and go through, let's say up San Ysidro. Since the sheriff is in control of the evacuation, and your scenario is 3 to 4, let's say that's when there's the most congestion on the freeway, that limits the sheriff's staff to, let's say, if you pick a stop sign down at the bottom of Olive Mill or something, that they're not even going to have staff there to implement one of your suggestions. It's in the big report of having monitors where they're acting basically to let people go through a stop sign in mass. So do you address the fact that the sheriff's controlling the evacuation, or is this just as if nobody was there and there was all of a sudden an evacuation alarm?
I think we are assuming that those would be staffed traffic control points, and would be necessary to coordinate with the sheriffs as part of that capacity building and coordination need, because so many people have different responsibilities during non-evacuation and also during an evacuation. The idea of providing the comprehensive list in the report about locations that would benefit from additional traffic control points, or additional traffic control to allow that southbound traffic to clear through, is purely to provide a comprehensive list of all of the locations where that condition is present, where it's stop controlled in the southbound direction, not stop controlled in the east-west direction. And so if you imagine, a line of cars trying to make a right or left onto State Route 192 to get out of their own neighborhood, and can't get onto the road because it's free flow in the east-west direction and they're stopped at a stop sign. So that's all of the locations where that condition exists. During an evacuation event, I imagine that there would be a prioritization or specific locations identified that are most important to staff up based on the fire spread patterns. And again, we didn't tie that specifically to this first or second scenarios that we've analyzed with the model in this report, because we thought it was more valuable to include a comprehensive list of all the places that might benefit from that because they meet those traffic flow conditions.
So the sheriff that basically is in control of this wasn't really consulted with like how long they think it would take to get personnel to do something like that or whatever.
Yeah, so
you're doing it outside of that model.
It's a process outside of the modeling process. Exactly. We did have a stakeholder meeting with attendees from the sheriff's office and many other agencies that have touch points on an evacuation. And so, yeah, lots of communication. I know outside of that stakeholder meeting for this report, there's ongoing coordination and communication from the fire department to those entities. So we imagine this would be a really critical piece of information to share. And we didn't assume in our models that those controls were different, right? So we assumed that it's as built right now. We didn't assume anything about a human intervention to differently control the traffic at those locations.
Okay. So on your presentation on page 12, the East Valley and Hot Springs, there's kind of this funny spike on that. I mean, it has the spike, and then after the evacuation, there's this long kind of curve, and it's the only intersection that happened on. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of that curve, and I can pull up that slide if it's helpful for people to just take a look quick about what we're talking about here. I think you're referring to this curve right here, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think what we're seeing here is that it's actually happening after the evacuation window is complete. So my assumption is that it would be related to just the normal flow of traffic through Montecito on a normal weekday afternoon. In that evening period, we're looking at around 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So really picking up from that evening commute period. And a lot of that commuting happening on East Valley Road as the 101 becomes congested. And again, because it's the kind of model that finds the fastest path, if the 101 is already fully congested at that point by this time, related or unrelated to the evacuation, it's going to find a different way to allocate those trips. And so my guess is what's happening in the model is that it's sending the trips on the other viable east-west path. Because the 101 is fairly congested at that point.
So that basically, that part of the model would be whether there was an evacuation or not. I mean, that's our assumption.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry, I'll just share for one more second to just go back to this baseline here, this gray dotted line in the background of the model of this graph. This shows what would happen, like how the traffic would pick up during this afternoon period in a non-evacuation scenario. So you can see that same, 4 to 5 p.m. peaking that's happening across the entire community in that period of time, because that's when most people are leaving work and starting to travel again for the afternoon.
And then I have one kind of question just on evacuations. So the way you're dealing with this is on an eastern block, the north sector, say 1, 2, and 3, and then the west is 4, 5, 6. But when you ran all this modeling, is there any modeling where those overlap, or did you just try to keep those, figuring that something's going to come from the east or the west?
From the modeling perspective, we didn't run any overlapping scenarios. It is definitely possible to do, but I'll defer to someone at Fire if you want to do that differently. But yeah.
Director Lee, I'll take that. Thanks very much, Chelsea. Director Lee, to clarify both of the scenarios, they were based upon our current operational model for a wind-driven fire that starts in the forest and is running into the fire district, either similar to the T fire, the second day of the Jesucita fire, or December 16th of the Thomas fire.
So it's kind of based on historical.
Exactly. Our operational model today is to evacuate issue an evacuation order immediately for the 3 zones above Highway 192, and then to follow that shortly thereafter with an evacuation warning for the areas below Highway 192. Okay. So both scenarios were based upon today's actual operational direction of staff.
Okay.
Could I just ask a question, and going back in memory for a few fires? I know a lot of people, when they realize the wind is up and they see smoke and they hear rumbles from a fire district, they start agitating and moving out long before you start your evacuation. Don't you see that? I mean,
Yes.
yeah, and also people find other ways to get home from work, going from Santa Barbara to Ventura, which is tough.
Yes.
They make accommodations by facts on the ground.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Chelsea's work showed was in both of those scenarios that you just described, that goes towards the background traffic that causes some of the problems.
Mm-hmm. And doesn't the highway patrol come into picture? I remember they did with the debris flow.
They do. I was going to let Director Lee finish asking his questions, and then I had a couple of comments about the sheriff's office question. So we meet annually with all of the stakeholders before fire season that are involved in evacuation. So that includes the highway patrol, who has responsibility for the state routes, so Highway 192 and 101, the sheriff's office, Caltrans, Department of Public Works for the county, American Red Cross, County Office of Emergency Management, Santa Barbara City Fire, County Fire, and Carp Summerlin Fire, and have a discussion in advance of our fire for that year on how we're all going to work together. One of the things that occurs is the first fire resource, the battalion chief from our agency that arrives at scene, partners with the first law enforcement officer and establishes unified command. One of the things that they determine immediately is the area that needs to be evacuated. And then the law enforcement officer has the authority to make that evacuation. As soon as they make that determination, they start to identify the critical traffic control points. So those areas on the map where they're not necessarily just waving people through stop signs, they're preventing people from clogging that intersection as well. And so it's a fairly heavy lift, given that there's 3 law enforcement officers that we can count on immediately, about 6 in the first 15 minutes, and then maybe up to 10 in the first hour. Very best case scenario, assuming that they can get here through the evacuation traffic. And then that problem or that challenge is compounded a little bit because the sheriff's office does door knock evacuations. So the majority of those patrol officers for the sheriff's office are engaged in the physical evacuation of the community rather than staffing traffic control points.
And so, speaking of the highway patrol, they only have jurisdiction, well, would they have it over 192 because it's a state highway, and they'd have it over the freeway? That's how much manpower would that potentially add?
It depends upon time of day. So time of day, the scenario is running on a weekday. Their entire office, the Alita office, has 6 officers and 1 supervisor. That's the very best case scenario. If the fire happened at 10 p.m. at night, the background traffic in Chelsea's model would be less, but so would the law enforcement available. And I want to say they have 2 on duty.
Wow, what about the fact that many of the fires that come east to west, we'd have CARP involved, Summerlin involved?
Correct.
Sure.
Yeah, there is no fire that occurs on the front country of Santa Barbara. So from the Gaviota Tunnel to Highway 150, that is a single jurisdictional responsibility. It will always be either us and the Forest Service and County Fire, or us and the city, the Forest Service and County Fire, or us, Carpinteria, Forest Service, County Fire.
Did the reformation of your communication systems, which has just, I think, been completed, is that going to add another dimension of efficiency?
It will. When we switch to the Regional Fire EMS Dispatch Center, all of the things that take minutes to occur today, from the time the call is processed, to all those resources getting on the road to attack the fire, to the issuance of the evacuation order, will go from taking minutes to taking seconds. Yeah, substantial time savings. Yeah, great point.
Would it be more, as far as use of time for the sheriffs until more of them come on duty, to use loudspeakers in neighborhoods so that it would free people,
They do
free
do
more
that.
officers for traffic control? 'Cause
They
that
most
seems
definitely
really
do that.
a better use of. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have, is there any other questions? So we have public, is there any public that would like to ask a question?
I'd like to ask a question, please.
Sure. Can
Just
you
trying to
state
figure
your
out.
name?
Yes, my name is Joe Cole. I was trying to figure out how to unmute or how to hold up my hand. So Chelsea, I've lived here in the community for a long time. I can't even count the times I've been evacuated, just like everybody else here. Just a kind of a dumb question. So on page 11, for instance, it's a general question, but if you could pull up page 11 and screen share that, you'll.
Of the PowerPoint slides?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay.
This is really a basic question, but it's important to me. So when we're looking at the evacuation window, we're looking at the peak, you know, in the first 15 minutes. And on some of your other slides, you showed, you know, red. So if I'm up on any of the higher roads like East Mountain Drive, one way or the other, what does that mean to me evacuating? What does the red mean?
Yeah, that's
you know, we know the campfire, for instance, 8 people were killed in their cars. And I'm assuming the sheriffs aren't there yet from what I just heard. Am I sitting there in traffic? Am I going to make it out? Am I going to get burned up? What are those heavy red lines? Yeah, that's a perfect example up at the top there. It looks like it's at Cold Springs. What does that mean in the real world? The heavy red.
Yeah,
during the
that's a great
evacuation?
question. And I apologize. I should have covered that when I was going over these maps. This is symbolized based on a volume to capacity ratio, which is a common metric in the transportation and traffic world to show how bad congestion is. Anything that's green is more or less free flow, including up through, light yellow. Anything that's in the yellow to orange, 0.5 volume to capacity means that there's twice as much volume, twice as much capacity available as there is volume using it. So with stop signs, with traffic signals, even though that sounds like, twice as much capacity to the volume means should be free flow, it more or less is, but you might be in stop and go for a moment here and there. Anything up to 1 in this orange to red area is a much higher ratio of the volume of the vehicles on the roadway and the capacity of the roadway itself. So if you have exactly equal roadway capacity and roadway volume, you're pretty much maxed out on your roadway, and you're going to be in either stop and go traffic given people's merging in and out of lanes. Like there's other behavioral things that drivers do to, if everyone was moving full steam ahead, right, everyone would be moving on exactly the right number of vehicles and exactly the right amount of capacity to serve those vehicles. But we know that's not how people drive. There's stop signs, there's traffic lights, there's left and right turns. So it would be congested definitely in the red zones. It would, whether it's stop and go or fully standstill traffic, it's hard to say. Anything in this greater than 1 means that the volume exceeds the capacity available. And so on some of these very deep red, I'm not even sure actually if we get into that very deep red on this one, but perhaps on the other scenario, there's a moment of, deeper red that's available that's showing on the network here. That would definitely be like a highly, highly congested condition. The other element that's showing on this map is the width of the line. So the width of the line actually shows the vehicle flow. And so that's why the lines are much wider on the US 101 compared to some of these other roads. And actually why, this road here is narrower than this road, even though it's the same color. It's because more traffic is served, more vehicles are served on the wider line. So the stop and go condition is probably pretty similar here compared to here, but you're still processing more vehicles here because of the conditions of the road are either wider or have a higher capacity, maybe a higher posted speed limit, fewer, curves and things that slow people down or make people tap the brakes. So I would say that's what I can offer, whether it's what the actual experience is like traveling through that. I can't say beyond what I've just shared. The other condition and consideration is that during a fire, we know that people are anxious and maybe not driving, the way that they normally would in a non-evacuation condition. We know there might be smoke, there might be other contributing factors that could make a congested situation feel a lot worse than if you were just, in stop and go traffic on your normal commute home. And so, yeah, all things to take into consideration.
So does it depend? So whether I get out to save my life and my family, does that depend then on the fire? So I'm stuck in the red, yeah, and it's touch and go, slow. In a T fire situation, for instance, when driven, down past Westmont, moving very quickly, that's an independent variable, right? You don't really figure out from this model whether people are going to be able to get out, because you have to input the kind of fire, the direction, all of those kinds of things. This just shows the level of traffic in that 15 period.
Yes, that's correct. It's not meant to be a prediction of outcomes in the way that you're describing.
I think he's dreading being called a traffic jam.
Thank you.
That answer your question, Mr. Cole?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from anybody on Zoom?
There's somebody.
Okay,
Where?
I don't see any hands up around me, and nobody has unmuted.
Okay.
Do No checks, correct? Joyce?
Okay, we're gonna close the public comment on this matter and go back to the board. Is there any further questions?
Sobering report.
Yeah.
So I'd be happy to offer a couple of closing comments before you.
Okay.
I would just
consider
like
your
to
action.
I would like to say the wild card is all this construction. The huge vehicles are blocking ordinary places, which are great on this map. And I use them a lot to get to back and forth to town, but I just needs to have, it's up to us to figure out where those detours go and all of that. So I mean, I think that's a wild card that hasn't been factored in.
Yeah. Just an experiential footnote. I've noticed berms going up for flood control. But what that has done, at least around our home, is to limit where parking can take place. And what that's done is move cars into the right of way. And what that's done is you can't have two cars going in opposite directions. And I was thinking the other day, if anybody parks as they would have normally done, it's now impassable for somebody. It's like an emergency vehicle. And it's almost like we're swimming against each other. I don't know what to do about that, but it's an ironic twist to step in the right direction here, but a step back over here. So I guess I'll have to fly.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for all the hard work and thank Chelsea too and everybody who contributed. It's just really amazing and very helpful for the community as well as I'm sure Montecito Fire and all of their mutual aid partners to have this.
Yeah, Chelsea, I mean, your simplified presentation was easier to read than the full report. But it was really complete, so. Okay,
Great, thanks very much, Director Lee. So staff agrees with all the recommendations in the report. Those are found on agenda pages 44 through 49. We feel that it validated scientifically what we anecdotally thought to be true as we look at our challenges in the community. We also recognize that other communities experience and are experiencing very similar challenges to our community, both through our professional contacts and also from working with Chelsea, who's working for several other communities doing the exact same thing. We recognize that our evacuation orders must be precise. In other words, not necessarily as large as we previously pondered, and that our messaging has to be clear and concise. We also recognize that we have pretty significant challenges deconflicting the evacuation traffic with the emergency responder traffic. So again, the model shows just evacuation traffic. It doesn't show our 30 fire engines and law enforcement vehicles with the fire. And then lastly, the Highway 101 project, which will last about 3 years through our community, is going to present very significant challenges that require us to consider moving traffic east and west on Highway 192 as opposed to south down to the freeway, where there will most definitely be impediments while we're waiting for the roundabouts to be constructed. Concludes my comments. Thank you.
thanks.
You can go APS. And this 192 go 8, like I did go APS, Hot Springs. The terrace, the garden, the princess.
So this is a final and received, but also an or potentially could be an implementation of this motion as a motion. So do I have
On implementation.
to accept the recommendations for the department to move forward?
Staff did offer a suggestion on page 6 of your agenda.
I'll be happy to make a motion.
I'll second
We're all present, so.
Yeah, you still have to do it.
We still have numbers on. Okay, Director Damian.
Aye.
Director Van Dyne,
Aye.
Director Easton,
Aye.
Director Lee, and Director Powell is absent.
Motion passes. Thanks again, Chelsea. That was great. So appreciate all your time.
Thank you all. Have a good
Thanks,
week.
Chelsea.
Thank you.
Okay, number 3 is approval of resolution 2022-13, authorizing a remote teleconference meeting for a period of 30 days pursuant to the Brown Act and its strategic plan goal number 3. And Chief Taylor.
Thank you very much, Director Lee. Continue to have remote teleconference meetings. Assembly Bill 361 requires that you reaffirm this resolution every 30 days. Therefore, staff recommends that you adopt resolution 2022-13.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
Can we get a roll call?
Of course, Director Stevens,
Aye.
Director Van Dyne,
Aye.
Director Easton,
Aye.
Director Lee, Director Powell is absent.
Okay, motion passes. Number 4 is approval of minutes from June 27, 2022, regular meeting. Does anybody have any changes? Amendments? Seeing none, can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, can we get a roll call?
Of course, Director Stevens,
Aye.
Director Van Dyne,
Aye.
Director Easton,
Aye.
Director Lee.
Okay, approval of minutes, fire chief's report.
Thanks very much, Director Lee. As usual, we will start with our operations report, and because it is July, we have the quarterly operations report that will be presented by Chief Taylor.
Thank you, Chief Taylor. Joyce brings the slides up. As Chief stated, we're now into our second quarter for 2022 to review both call statistics, our response data, and some of our highlights of our operations, training, personnel, and accomplishments. If you go to slide 2, Joyce, it shows our response data for 2022 for our second quarter. We responded to 355 calls within those 3-month period. Our pie chart shows that once again, our EMS totals are around 50%, which shows overall our department does a lot more than just the average, with most departments being in the 80% category for EMS, that we're serving our community in a lot of different ways, which is exactly what we'd like to see. Moving on to the next page, our board directs us. Our 7-minute response map shows our responses within the district boundaries for emergency calls. Those are the calls where we use red lights and sirens. The next page shows the total of 110 calls over the quarter. We've met our goal of 85%, 94 calls on scene within 7 minutes or less. 16 of our calls we were over that 7-minute mark. So we didn't need the 90% like we did last quarter. As we looked into some of our additional responses, we found some of our data that some of the calls that we thought should have been code 3 were actually reduced to code 2 en route. So as we find out our responses, I think we'll go closer again to that 90% threshold as we take a look at our data a little bit closer. Moving on to the next slide, some of our noteworthy incidents. We did respond to a vegetation fire in the carpentry of foothills over the quarter. It was days after we completed our dispatch training, and you can see our response was very thorough. While Montecito tones were going off, so were the tones for Santa Barbara County Fire, Ventura County Fire, as well as those Cadre National Forests. So those resources were responding all at the same time, which was exactly what the outcome we wanted from the training we had performed days before. Next slide, we also responded to a fire in the Carpentry of Summerlin Fire Protection District Ridge incident, which was a fire along the railroad tracks. Fortunately, some of the Union Pacific Railroad equipment was still on scene, and an excavator was able to help our personnel, the Carpentry of Summerlin's personnel, on the rehab of that incident. So moving those heavy timbers, we benefited from having that heavy equipment on scene. Once again, on to the next slide, our mutual aid partners have requested our assistance, and we responded as usually on a 5-engine strike team to San Luis County on the Camino fire. Our resources there for 4 days. And once again, it shows our importance of the mutual aid system and how we respond to assist other agencies in their time. The next slide shows some of our unique opportunities within the district. That house up on the right-hand side was donated to the department and our adjoining agencies for a training evolution lasting about a week before they bulldoze that residence. So we were able to make use of the Santa Barbara City Truck Company to do evolutions on ventilation on the second story of the structure. We were able to do firefighter rescues through some of our Mayday evolutions in the basement of that structure. And we spent days training our personnel on clothesline evolutions. And this training was very beneficial for the amount of firefighters that got to go through that structure. And it's something that during the COVID period of time, when we couldn't do a lot of hands-on training with other agencies, it really allowed us to get back into our training and honing our skills with firefighting evolutions and just being able to work with one another and getting familiar with our training. On the next slide, we were also then invited to evolutions within the city of Santa Barbara. Framework drive training allowed all 3 shifts to join our partners in Santa Barbara City Fire Department to work on rescue evolutions, track victims within a structured fire scenario. Your battalion chief, Travis Editor, was one of the incident commanders for the evolutions of that drill. We also were out doing our wildland training throughout both the Cold Springs Trail and other areas within the district. That's the picture up on the upper right. We also traveled to be part of the operational area of Wildland Urban Interface Trail, which was held in the San Luis Valley this year. And our agency, agencies from San Luis County, also participated in that training evolution. Our firefighters have also done drills, the disorientation drill here within our quarters. Going on to the next slide. As we mentioned, some of our dispatcher training and Cadre training, that was a significant evolution in regards to running through a vegetation fire starting in our community and sharing our information from our dispatch center into the county dispatch center, and practicing that evolution allowed us to reduce our time frame getting agencies on the road. I can definitely say when a fire happened in Carpinteria the following day, when our tones were going off in our stations, the tones were going off at the same time. The county fire department was Padres National Force. So from our very first evolution to the actual fire 2 days later, we saved almost 5 to 6 minutes in response time. So I can say that was a win-win for our organization. Moving on to the next slide, our personnel updates. This is always a highlight. Obviously, we had our graduation of our academy class. We had 3 members from our organization within the academy and 2 members from Park Summerlin Fire. So that was definitely a highlight for our organization, getting those people on the floor. And below the picture of 5 folks passing their probation, 1-year probation, and welcoming them into the department. The next slide, and I know Chief Taylor's going to hit a little bit on our July 4th, but just wanted to show some pictures of that event. Obviously, a welcomed site for the community, and we had a picture there of our Rotary Club partners helping out mixed batter there inside the fire station. Next slide, please. Last slide is a construction update. Obviously, the construction is moving along. The facility, the house is being, at this point, plumbing and electrical is being completed on the inside, as well as compared to some of the roof structure of the other house that was damaged during the
Any questions for Chief Dales on operations?
Pure curiosity. Did they ever figure out, whoever would figure it out, what started that fire on the railroad right away? With the heavy timbers, how could that, how did that happen?
I would have to check with Kirk Summerlin on the cause, on the Union Pacific.
At your leisure, but you know what I mean? It's so weird.
There was a lot of construction folks in the area working that afternoon, so I know they were in the area at the start, so I can get that information back from Kirk Summerlin.
Thanks very much, Chief Niels. Chief Reiner is going to report on the code adoption schedule.
All right, thank you, Chief. Yeah, just one item for me today. Code adoption has started, so the International Fire Code was updated and such. California Fire Code was updated as well, and so we received that update first part of July. I mean, we're in the process of working through all of those amendments and potential amendments for our local ordinance. So the timeline for that, we anticipate being able to present that first reading to you in October, the October meeting, and then the second reading. And report.
Great, thanks very much, Chief Reiner. And then briefly, I mentioned the 101 project. I wanted to assure you that we're working closely with the entire 101 team as they work through the design phase and start to plan the construction phases. As I mentioned, it will be a 3-year project, and it's going to involve weekly coordination meetings, both for emergency response and for evacuation. And then finally, to conclude, I wanted to go through the outcome of yesterday's Ready SBC alert test that we did in our community. And so Christina put together a short presentation, so just 4 slides. So bear with me as I give you some data. And before I do that, I want to congratulate Christina. She did the heavy lifting on this test to include the community engagement beforehand. And you'll see that that had a very, very, very positive response. Next slide, please. There are 6,308 contacts registered inside our jurisdiction. So the area that's shaded is the fire district boundaries. And those were the areas that were alerted. Of note is from when we started our public engagement, July 7th, that was our community meeting, until when the test occurred, more than 300 new community members signed up to receive alerts, which is a big deal. That puts us almost at 90% of the community opting in to our emergency alert system. Of those, 1,003 confirmed receipt of the alert. So when that comes as a text message on your phone, you type in yes, or if you receive it through the app, there's a button that you can click, or if you receive it through an email, there's a button you can click. 1,003 people did that. That represents 16% of our registered users, which you can see is about 15 times more than what most communities enjoy. It's usually between 0.5% and 3%. And then I won't bore you with all the data on the 3 bullets that follow, other than to summarize to say that we have a lot of cleanup to do in our database where people are registered multiple times, because the first time that might be one of these, the first time that they signed up, they forgot their username or their password. But there is a back end of the system where we can link all of those together. So that's our mission in the next several months for Christina to start working on that. We had a call center set up here. You can see that when the test came out, that's what's shown on the left part of the slide, that it said if they had questions to call our office here. So we had 4 call takers available, and because we anticipated many, many calls, and we received a whopping 14 calls from the community, and most of them were either clarification on what they were supposed to do, or they needed assistance creating their account. That concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I have a comment on that. When you receive the report, if you the notice, if you didn't click on it then and you waited, like I looked at it last night and I went to click on it, it said you timed out.
That's correct.
So you're missing. I know other people had one of my clients that we were standing there talking whether they got a notice and they hadn't clicked on it either. So
yeah.
there's a percentage in there. Is there any way to make that so that it lasts longer?
There is not, so the system is hard set on how long till you can respond, and I won't bore you with the number of variables in there. I'll tell you my experience. I have, we use that system internally for notifications, like when we send an engine to a fire out of county, or something's broken, a significant event occurs, we send messages to our sales staff utilizing that system. So I get it first on a text, and then second through the app, and then third a phone call, and then fourth an email. That all occurs within about 10 minutes if I don't acknowledge one of those. So basically what the system is saying is, I don't have my cell phone with me, so they're going to send it a different way. And I don't have that available, so they're going to send it a different way. So that's how it times out.
Okay.
Well, mine just came on the phone without it ringing, it just came on.
Just popped up.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'll remind you that in the test environment, we're not setting off the wireless emergency alert system. So the wireless emergency alert system overrides your phone settings and actually sets off that horrible.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's only for actual emergency situations. So we would never activate that during the test environment.
Okay, any other questions? Good. All right, thanks for everybody that presented. We'll close 5 and go to Board of Directors report. Is there anything to report? No. Seeing none. Close 6, we go to 7, suggestions from directors for items other than regular agenda items to be included on the August 22nd, 2022 regular board meeting.
Yeah, in reference to the report on page 41 regarding the that we work with Santa Barbara County to understand development capacity associated with SB 9. I personally would like to understand that too, because now we're talking about our future here and what could be very significant impacts. So I would like to request that we agendize a time when our staff could provide an understanding of the impact of Senate Bill 9 on our evacuation and our increased hazard or not. I just, right now, it's a big unknown, and I would really appreciate that.
I second that.
Okay.
I
I
just,
think that, sorry, go ahead.
no, you.
We most certainly have capacity. We did a little bit of work on that late last year as the city of Santa Barbara was working through their urgency ordinance for the very high fire severity zone. So we are aware of several of the alternatives. I assume you or your staff has a couple hours you can dedicate to that. I think we'd be able to report back on the implications in our community of Senate Bill 9 to include the density question at the office.
Okay. Thank you.
I was just wanting an update, which I did get from the chief in a meeting, but about the hiking situation up there at Hot Springs at the beginning of the trailhead there, and the parking situation and the limited capacity the fire district has compared to the huge responsibility the fire district has for fire prevention and firefighting compared to all the government agencies that control that trailhead access. I mean, it would be helpful if everyone understood that. It's just
So-
unbelievable to me
You mean the additional parking?
that the Forest Service accesses way up from the trailhead. They'll control that and what they feel their responsibility is. And that the community has won the case with the county to have no parking, and yet no one pays any attention to it. Who can enforce it? That's all. It's just seems to be quite a crazy quilt situation where if we need access, we have to get the highway patrol to tow the cars away. Anyway, it was interesting maybe to wrestle with that in one of the next meetings, agendize it.
We'd be happy to provide you an update on how all of that works and the fire district's concerns, maybe expand a little bit upon what we've already reported every single month, with the exception of this month during the fire chief's report on the issue with trailheads, emergency vehicle ingress, egress, the Fire Chiefs Association white paper towards the end of
True.
last year that we actually presented to you as a document, progress that we've made with the law enforcement as it relates to keeping the access and egress aisleways or roadways clear. I would be happy to update you formally on that if that's what you're asking
Maybe
for.
casually.
Well, I would remind the board that we have absolutely no jurisdictional authority beyond what we have implemented, and that there's currently litigation occurring on the specific location that you described.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
As an interim, and I don't know if it's appropriate right now, but a question. I shouldn't do it now. It's inappropriate for the agenda.
Yeah, this is
Oh,
suggestions.
okay. I like his crinkle.
Yeah, if it pleases the board, we would be more than happy to provide you a formal agendized formal update for you to receive and file at the next meeting.
Or could we just do it in the chief's report?
Yes,
Yeah, why don't we just do it that way rather than formalizing it?
right.
That's very good for me. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. I would just, my question was somewhere in here, it talks about marking the roads so that during a crisis, like 2 a.m, it's smoky and people are trying to get out of here, that the evacuation route be marked.
Yeah,
Like,
I thought that was a pretty good idea.
yeah, like stakes with reflector eyes. I don't know, I was picturing things. Is that a doable anytime soon or appropriate
so
even?
I don't know the answer, Director Van Dyne. That is certainly something that we're gonna look into because it is a recommendation of the report. So
Mhm.
I would say, we look at your adoption of the report today, your direction of staff to implement all the recommendations as really the beginning of the process rather than the end. There are 4.5 pages of 11-point recommendations in the evacuation report. And several of them we already do will enhance, but others are brand new. They're going to require a next level coordination with our stakeholders. And our first meeting to start doing that is on August 4th. So all of that will be considered.
Coming down the road.
Literally coming down.
This is something for items not on the regular agenda.
Yes.
Okay.
It's actually the fire chief. As far as the trail closures, I know they were closed for a certain amount of time last year. Does it require a red flag alert or something? What can prompt that to happen? If we're in the middle of a red flag warning or alert, it seems to me those things should close. It would be helpful as far as evacuation issue of residences and things.
Yeah, so there are, thank you for the question. There's 2 separate issues. The first is a red flag warning parking restriction. You'll recall that in that fire chief's task force recommendation that we adopted, there is a provision to explore the ability to do that on the entire front country of Santa Barbara. So from the Gaviota Tunnel to Highway 150, every trailhead that begins in the high road system would be similar to the tunnel trail in Mission Canyon, which is currently closed during red flag fire events. We have a coordinating meeting as part of that August 4th meeting, actually with law enforcement, to ensure that they're on the same page, that they think that that's a good idea, because they'll be the agency that has to enforce that. And when a red flag warning occurs, they actually overhire or for overtime hire officers to actually go and make that happen, either ticket the vehicles or tow them. So we won't get very far with board of supervisors with an ordinance amendment without the support of law enforcement. So we're working towards that beginning in August. The second prong of that is the actual closure of the trails. The trail system in our community is managed by Santa Barbara County Parks, a very short section of most of our trails, and then the Los Padres National Forest. There's no provision in county code or regulation that I'm aware of for them to close the county portion of that trail during a red flag fire warning. However, I can tell you that it's closed from dusk until dawn. So that's the county ordinance on the hours of the trail. The Los Padres National Forest, I've been here 8 years. In the 8 years that I've been here, has closed the forest twice. So not just the trails, but the entire forest. They do that based upon the current fire situation as it relates to resources available. So, and risk. So if there is high fire risk in their estimation and low resource availability, then they issue a forest order to actually close the forest. It is exceedingly rare. I don't know if Maeve's still here as a 20-year Forest Service employee. Maeve would tell you that it was unheard of previously. That's something that we've only started to see in the last several years. And it is nearly an act of Congress to make that happen, just short of an act of Congress, because the forests are the people's lands. They exist for the people to use, and they are always open by definition, but they never close. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, so we'll close number 7. Number 8 is closed session.
Yep.
Okay, we're back in session after a closed session with no reportable action, and it is 3:55, and the meeting is adjourned.